Welcome to Chess Dog. This is John. Today we've got a really high level game. None other than Magnus Carlsen versus perennial top 10 player Anish Giri. As you know, of course, Magnus has been the best player in chess for many years now and the current world champion, number one in the ratings, etc., etc. This game happened this year at the Tata Steel Masters in January. Carlsen has the white pieces, Giri has the black pieces. Let's get right into it. D4 was Carlsen's move, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and d5. Giri decides to go ahead and enter into a normal queen's gambit instead of a queen's Indian or bogo Indian. G3. So Carlsen plays the Catalan opening. This is very popular at the highest levels. It's the kind of opening that you have a long-term initiative. You're not trying to mate your opponent right out of the opening. You're trying to squeeze them and apply long-term pressure by putting the bishop on g2 and applying pressure along that long diagonal. Bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, castles. Giri plays a very orthodox setup and then grabs the pawn on c4. Now, this is usually not a permanent gambit, but the idea is to make white work to grab that pawn, and while white is taking time to take the pawn, you challenge this bishop on g2 and reduce white's counterplay. Knight to a3, threatening knight takes pawn. He can't allow that, so bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. So Giri has given up a very nice bishop. White now has the two bishops, but he has wrecked white's pawn structure. You see these pawns on the A file. However, he also gives Carlsen the half-open B file. So a lot of imbalances in this position. Bishop to D7. Giri's trying to play the bishop to C6 to challenge the bishop at G2, reduce its effectiveness. A4, giving this bishop at C1 room to go to A3, hit that rook at E8. Now that this bishop at E7 is gone, Carlsen wants that nice, beautiful, sweet diagonal. Bishop to C6, challenging that bishop. Bishop to A3, hitting the rook, so the rook must move. Queen to C2, threatening to grab that C4 pawn. Knight B to D7, defending this pawn indirectly, because if queen takes c4, knight to b6 hits the queen and the pawn, and when the queen moves, Giri could take the pawn and would be in pretty good shape. So knight b d7 indirectly defends c4. Rook a to c1, piling up on that pawn. By the way, this is the third time Magnus has had this position. This was the first game, and in the other two games, he's 1-1. He's won one, lost one. By the way, the game he lost was to Nepomniachtchi, so that'll tell you a little something. Rook a to c1, a6, perhaps opening up the possibility of defending the pawn with d5. Queen takes c4, grabs it before Giri can defend it. Knight to b6, hits the queen and the pawn, and the queen goes to c3, and knight takes a4. So Anish Giri's plan is going really well so far. He's up a pawn. He's placed a bishop opposite the bishop at g2, and his pawn structure is healthy. However, Carlsen has something that you'll hear a lot of the top players talk about. They'll say that they have a lot of easy moves to make. That is, there are a lot of easy moves that they don't have to think real hard. They have a series of moves that are obvious. And in this case, Carlsen has a lot of pressure on the queen side, and that allows him to make easy moves, and that can be an advantage in and of itself. He plays queen to b3. The threat is actually rook takes bishop, and after pawn takes, queen takes knight, and those two minor pieces for the rook would be in the pawn structure would be devastating. You can't allow that. So Giri plays queen to d5 to defend this bishop, but he goes ahead and plays the exchange sacrifice anyway. Taking with the pawn would be a disaster. This is just a lost position for black, so he's got to take with the queen. And now knight to e5, opening up that beautiful bishop and the knight on e5. The bishop on c6 was lost for the exchange, so this bishop has no opponent. Queen to b5, he would love to just trade rooks, get rid of all of that pressure. But queen to c2, he's not going to do that. And right now, Carlsen is threatening the move rook to b1, which would force the queen to a5, and then bishop to b4, hitting the queen, and he would be lost. So he has to do something about the threat of rook to b1, Giri does. So he plays knight to d5. If he played knight to b6, this might be his best and safest move after a series of moves like bishop b7, just taking, and it's a bit of a mess, but black can fight from this position. Instead, he plays the move knight to d5, attempting to block this g2 bishop's access to the b7 square. Rook to b1 hits the queen. The queen goes to a5. And now the bishop can't go to b4 because the knight controls that square. Another key idea behind knight to d5. Bishop takes d5. E takes d5. Perhaps taking with the queen possibly was a better decision. The computers prefer it anyway. So e d5. Now, Magnus has more than enough compensation for the exchange. He's got a pawn, for one thing, but he's got a well-placed knight at e5. This bishop is breathing fire down an important diagonal. The rook at b1 aiming at b7, the queen c7. He's got compensation, all he needs. He's probably a bit better here at this point. Like rook takes b7. He takes the material. Now the material is getting very close to equal. c5 was played. Knight to c3 was probably a better idea. This is what the computers recommend after bishop b4, queen a2 takes, and then just sort of holding in this position and hoping that the rook versus the two minor pieces is enough to survive. But Giri plays c5. He wants to undermine the knight at e5. However, one of the key positional principles when you're playing a game of chess that you have to ask yourself is, what is the weakest point in my opponent's position? Carlsen asks that question, and he zeroes in on the weakest square, most vulnerable square in Black's position. And in this case, it is the f7 square. He plays queen to f5. Now the knight, queen, and rook all aim at f7, and it's only defended by the king. Not good. Rook to f8, knight takes f7, queen to d8, pawn takes, queen to f6 to exchange queens and relieve that pressure against the king. Queens are exchanged, knight at h6 and king to h8, and we can take stock. Black is up in exchange, but down 2 pawns. His pawn structure is a mess, and his king is much less safe. With those advantages, and Carlsen is your opponent, it's really very bad news for Black in this position. c6 begins to advance the pawn. Yeah, and I forgot to mention White has a passed pawn on the c file as well. Rook f to c8, c7. Knight to c3, aiming at e2, also with the idea of maybe putting some pressure on the bishop and the pawn. Bishop to b2, placing it on that long diagonal, aiming at the king. d4, supporting the knight and blunting that bishop on the diagonal. Knight to f7 check, king to g7, and knight to d6. The knight at d6 hits the rook, controlling the queening square. The king goes to g6, and Carlsen is in no hurry at all. He just plays the move king to f1, defending e2. He knows that his setup here cannot be disturbed and that he is in very good shape. The knight goes to b5 to hit the pawn. Knight takes rook. Rook takes knight. a4 hits the knight, forcing it to make a decision. It goes ahead and takes the pawn, but bishop takes d4. And now, in this endgame, White's up 2 whole pawns. He regained the exchange. He's up 2 whole pawns. Has a better minor piece and a safer king. And after knight e6, bishop e3, in this position, Anish Giri resigned. So this was a real knockdown, drag out in the Catalan. There was a little back and forth. But we see Carlsen with the easier moves to play and the clear targets of attack, and it was very hard to do anything about it. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.